In this chapter, we will learn the basics of the modifier stack. That's a layers-based interface for modeling and animation. In the modeling domain, the modifier stack is a good example of something known as proceduralism. And that's a method for generating a model from simple parameters, almost like a recipe. And with procedural modeling, we don't have to worry about the points on the object. We only have to worry about the entire object itself. So we're going to define some very simple properties for this fruit bowl. Let's take a look at what I've done. We'll select the fruit bowl and go over to the Modify panel. And in the modifier stack area here, we see that there are a bunch of modifiers applied. I can disable a modifier by clicking on the little eye icon. So for this shell modifier, I can click on the eye and that'll disable the shell. And that illustrates to me that the shell modifier was adding thickness. Without it, we have an infinitely thin surface here. I'll re-enable the shell. There's also a stretch modifier, which is a parametric deformer. And if we look at this from the side and disable the stretch modifier, we can see that it's giving us some interesting shape to the fruit bowl. All right, so let's start fresh. We're going to create this from scratch. Go over to the File menu and reset 3ds Max. This is almost like restarting the program. And I don't need to save my changes. And yes, I really do want to reset. And now 3ds Max is back to a neutral default state. Before we create anything, let's get our units and grids sorted out. Go to the Customize menu and choose Units Setup. I'll set that to US Standard, feet with decimal inches, and the default units, inches. And click OK. Then go into the Home Grid settings. I can right-click on the 3D Snaps icon. Go to the Home Grid tab and set the grid spacing to 1 inch. Major lines every nth grid line set to 10. And the perspective view grid extent I'll set to 50. Press Enter. And now that's all set up. You can close grid and snap settings. And let's create a sphere as the base object. In the category Geometry, Standard Primitives, click on Sphere. And then click and drag in the top viewport. And then release the mouse. The reason I want to do it in the top viewport is so that the poles of the sphere are pointing up and down in the world z-axis. The viewport that you create something in actually makes a difference. I can illustrate that by going over to the front viewport and clicking and dragging to make another sphere. And then right-click to exit sphere creation. Select the Perspective panel and enable Edged Faces or Wireframe on Shaded with the keyboard shortcut, which is F4. And as we tumble around with Alt and middle mouse, it's very clear that this one, which was created in the top view, has its poles oriented up and down in the z-axis. And this one created in the front view has its poles oriented along the y-axis. All right, I'll select that one and delete it. Press the Delete key on the keyboard. Going back to my original sphere, select that. And let's change up its parameters. Go into the Modify panel, and we'll set its radius to 15 inches. So select the radius field and type in a value of 15, 1-5, and press Enter. And notice that it converted that into 1 foot and 3 inches. And that's due to the unit setup that we defined a moment ago. We can also change its color, make it a little bit easier to see. And up here at the top of the Modify panel, we see the object's name and color. Click on the color swatch and just set it to a neutral gray. And click OK. We can adjust the number of segments. Let's get in closer with the mouse wheel and move the view with the middle mouse button. And we've got the number of segments here, which is the level of detail or the fidelity or the approximation of curvature. And as I click and drag on the spinner here, I can increase or decrease the number of segments and change the level of detail on the fly. Click and hold the mouse on the little spinner arrow and drag up to increase the number of segments, drag down to reduce the number of segments. And with very few segments, such as only 4, we're no longer seeing a sphere, but an octahedron. I'll set this to a pretty mid-range level of detail of 64 segments and press enter. Finally, we just want to position the sphere at the origin in the world. Select a Move tool. And then in the Transform Type In dialog area down here, we just want all of those to read out a value of 0. X of 0, press Tab, Y 0, press Tab, and Z also 0, and press Enter. All right, that's how we set up a scene in preparation for a procedural model with the modifier stack, and that introduces us to the concept of level of detail or fidelity.